bills that this Assembly will pass. Like the author of the bill has said, there's absolutely no doubt, and we can't argue, that there's absolute need for us as a country to fund our military. Mr. Speaker, sir, we live in an increasingly dangerous world, and our first line of defense are the men and women in uniform. Only this morning, it was brought to the floor of the House the killing of one of the aid workers. And from the collective debates from all our colleagues around the floor, everybody spoke to the fact that we need a strong military. Copiously every day, Mr. Speaker, sir, we quote from the Constitution, section 14(2), where we all say that security and welfare of the people shall be the primary purpose of government. Mr. Speaker, sir, only recently in the United States, the election was based on Make America Great Again. Of course, part of that was increased military funding because they understand and we all recognize that might is right in global politics. Mr. Speaker, but of course, I know that there are certain people also who are going to be a little concerned about this. And around the world and everywhere, there's always the talk about increased military funding. Mr. Speaker, there will always be politicians, people in the military as well as policymakers who will be absolutely on the side of increased military funding. But there will also be the group of people who would advocate cuts in defense spending because they believe that the money can be used for other domestic priorities like roads, schools, hospitals, and critical infrastructure, agriculture. All this is understandable, Mr. Speaker, my dear colleagues, that in the competition for scarce public funds, defense spending, like foreign policy spending, has a very small local constituency. Most of the soldiers are confined to the barracks, but we all as a country and as a people will recognize and feel the impact when we have a weak military. Mr. Speaker, what is the purport of this bill? This bill seeks alternative means of funding for our military. The lack of adequate funds has created a readiness crisis in our country. As a country, we've gotten more vulnerable. As a country, our military is weakened. And of course, since we serve in the Committee of Nations, we can see that other rival nations have accelerated their force development on their own. And when they haven't done that, they've entered into critical strategic alliances with other world countries. Oh, thank you. Okay. They have entered into critical alliances with other world nations. Mr. Speaker, sir, when they haven't done that, in cases like countries like Cameroon, they have entered into historical alliances, all to beef up their security. Mr. Speaker, sir, I don't want to say that there's a global conspiracy against Nigeria, but Nigeria has only just crawled its way out of the issues with the Leahy laws and the alleged human rights infractions of Nigeria. And of course, it's only now that our Nigerian government has been able to buy arms to even equip our military. When we haven't been held by the Leahy laws, the Castor laws have held us. Now, what are the Castor laws? The Castor laws are laws that have been passed by the United States Congress as well that seeks to penalize countries that buy arms from the Soviet Union. Mr. Speaker, sir, as a country and as a people, we have consistently displayed complacency and nonchalance to military issues. There have been allegations that after a series of coups and counter-coups in Nigeria, that the military deliberately underfunded the military. Of course, fast forward to 1999 when civilians took over, there was also the fear that the civilians underfunded the military because we wanted to whittle down the powers of the military so that we could confine them to the barracks. Mr. Speaker, the consequence of that is that we have weakened our military for the core work that our military must do. In Nigeria, for too long, Mr. Speaker, we've asked our military to do too much for too little. A large number of our military formations, from divisions to battalions, are below full strength and are ill-equipped. The military is currently overstretched with internal security operations in at least 30 out of 36 states of the country. There's also 9 ad hoc military operations from the Joint Task Force from the counter-terrorism war in the Northeast to the Joint Task Force in the Niger Delta to the Special Task Force in Plateau, and at least 9 other ad hoc military arrangements from Crocodile Smile to Safe Haven. All these operations have stretched our military, and the battles and the soldiers are battle fatigued. Mr. Speaker, globally in Africa, Nigeria ranks number 5 as the strongest military in Africa. Nigeria comes number 5 after countries like Egypt, Algeria, Ethiopia, and South Africa. But what does that mean, Mr. Speaker? That even in our sub-region, we still are the strongest military. And because of that, we are called upon to to create peace and to ensure democracy in countries, and we've done that. We've carried that out very successfully in places like Sierra Leone. We've carried that out, and very recently in the Gambia. All of us as a country, Mr. Speaker, yearn for a more mobile, better equipped military, more men, more helicopters for resupply, reinforcement, and evacuation of the wounded in battle. We want a military with conditions that can attract the most patriotic and most dedicated men and women, knowing, Mr. Speaker, sir, that this is probably the only occupation in the world that you take on knowing that you may be called upon to pay the supreme sacrifice. Mr. Speaker, this bill does not leave out wartime widows, their families, and veterans. We also want to build a military that is reconfigured to face current threats of terrorism, battling non-state actors, mobile enemies that are amorphous in nature. All this costs money, Mr. Speaker. We can only have the military we pay for, not the military we wish we had. We must recognize that the budgetary provisions are grossly inadequate. The envelope system of government of budgeting is inadequate for the defense budget. We are conscious of the fact that due to dwindling resources, that it is impossible and a high debt profile with $63 that we earn currently going to debt servicing. It is impossible for us as a country to have the military that we want. Mr. Speaker, I know that a lot of people are concerned about where the funds are going to come from and how they're going to be administered, but I have absolutely no doubt that when we get to the committee stages, that we'll look at that. Mr. Speaker, only recently, and the reason I want to draw justification for this fund, only recently, Mr. Speaker, sir, the Nigerian government spent $420 million procuring 20 Super Tucano aircraft. There was a hue and cry, even on the floor of Parliament, about the fact that this was extra budgetary expenditure. What do we learn from that? That in spite of the fact that whatever we do, that our military must be funded. Now, as people who are custodians of the purse, we have a choice. Do we want to create a fund that we can control, that creates institutional control, that curbs waste, that we can track, or do we want to leave it open for the government to dip their hands into any account and take the monies from wherever they want to? Mr. Speaker, we cannot constantly speak about the fact that we want transparency, that we're in control of the purse, and yet we do not give government the alternatives that they require for these funds, for them to have a place to get this fund. I will therefore urge my colleagues that we all support this piece of legislation because it is of the utmost import that we strengthen our military. It is of the utmost import that we start to offer commitment rather than echo, that this is the legislative solution to all the motions on Nigeria's internal security. And again, I would urge my colleagues to please support this motion in honor of our dear colleague, Honorable Funke Adedoyin, who was very passionate about this and who has asked that we please pass this in her memory and on her behalf. Thank you very much.